Okay, hello everybody and welcome to this session. We're very excited today because we have with us a rather lovely lady who's a fantastic artist and illustrator and a wonderful calligrapher, and she's going to be doing an interesting session for us because I don't think we've ever had a beginner's session. However, having said it's a beginner's session, it's also going to be tremendous fun for anybody who draws and paints regularly. So I would like to introduce you to Lucia.
Hi Jules. Hi everybody.
Happy to see you and thank you very much for doing this session for us today.
You're welcome.
As I say, it will be a little bit different. So would you like to tell us a little bit about what we'll be doing, and I'll hand over to you.
Okay, so I'm just going to hop down to my other camera and I can show you what we're up to. Okay, so specs on. Some of the nature journaling that I've been doing recently has I've been creating these pages in my sketchbooks, which are like a nature table, really. They're sort of collections of little objects, and the way that I've been putting them together, I call it snack sketching. So very much like throughout the day where you might sort of pick at a biscuit, or the biscuit tin, every time you walk past it. I'm doing the same with drawing and sketching things. So I'm doing it over a period of a week or 2 weeks where I just add a small element onto a sketchbook page, so that gradually it builds up to be a whole coverage, but it's in bite-sized pieces. And on this particular week here, which was the 2nd of April 2023, there was lots of rain and loads of worms. So here are, and I was trying to just look at, well, first I was just looking at beautiful things that were emerging in my garden. And then I thought, well, the worms are really beautiful. And they'd make a great addition to this page because they worked really well at filling in the gaps. And so I started drawing some of the worms that were sort of wiggling around in my raised beds, and had such a nice time drawing them that I thought they'd be a really good thing to do in this session. They are a brilliant subject matter for beginners because they don't have any limbs, obviously. They don't have any wings, so they can't fly away. They do wiggle a bit, but they're so simple. And so for a beginner, it's a fantastic place to start adding little creatures into your sketchbook and growing in confidence. But if you're a more experienced artist, looking at simple shapes is just as beneficial because it acts like a very sort of gentle drawing meditation to look and maybe draw the worm as it's moving. So you could have one worm all over your page, but just in different positions. So it's an accessible little invertebrate to to start with, and then you could go on to more complicated things like bees and butterflies and stuff, which I find incredibly difficult to draw. Anything with wings, basically, and lots of legs. But we're in safe territory with worms. So the other one thing I wanted to show you is that what we're going to work today on is worms, but the same techniques could be used for other little creatures like tadpoles. So really looking at and finding simple creatures that you could use this same technique for. And again, I haven't used pencil on here. I've just used some watercolour. So that I can be drawing these little tadpoles as I'm literally sat by the edge of my pond, just doing blobs and then little wiggles. And really that's all these worms are. They're just a bit less blobby and more wiggly, so and a different colour. And to do these, I've used coloured pencil and watercolour, and there's a tiny little bit of a white, you can use a coloured pencil or a gel pen just to add little highlights, but that's not essential if that's something you haven't got. Okay, so that's what we're aiming for then. So you've got a few worms on your handout, which have been, you can see, freshly dug up from my garden. And I've been on the website of the Earthworm Society of Great Britain, And there are 27 species of earthworm in the UK, and all of them are lots of different colours, but we're aiming on this kind of sort of purpley, pinky, bluey, yellowy sort of colour, this sort of standard earthworm, as it were. So what I'd like you to do first is grab a piece of paper or your sketchbook and a pencil, which could be your coloured pencil or just a normal graphite pencil. The coloured pencils that I've got are oil-based pencils. I've got a Luminance, which is in burnt sienna, and that's by Caran d'Ache. And I've got a, so what is this? A Polychromos by Faber-Castell in Indian red. So any warm colour, like a warm dark brown or a warm dark pink or dark red, will work really well. And if you've got watercolour pencils, that's going to have a different effect, but it's going to look really interesting. So we're going to do two things in this mini workshop. We're going to be working with watercolour to draw the worms and then drawing on top with a pencil. And then we're also just going to draw them and then add watercolour on top. So we're using the same tools in different ways. So what I'd like you to do first of all is grab your watercolours, and you need primary colours for these little worms. And I know that you know this from primary school, but those colours are red, yellow and blue. And it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to pop my light on a bit. It's a bit dark. It doesn't really matter which reds, yellows and blues you use. Because you'll just get a different version of the colours, and that will be relevant in your palette. But I like to try and use very sort of cold, saturated colours. So what you'd imagine a bright red to be, a bright blue to be, and a brightish yellow. So I've got a brush which is a size 8, so quite a nice big brush. And I've also got a brush which is a size 6, and they are pointed brushes. So load up your brush with some water, and I'm going to grab some of my red paint and pop it on my palette. And I want to create a really nice puddle of paint. You don't want it too dry, because watercolours do their best work when they are absolutely loaded with water, but you still want lots of colour in there. You don't want them to be too wishy-washy. I'm going to rinse my brush off, and I'm also going to mix up some yellow. Again, I've got a lovely bright cold yellow, and I'm constantly going back, getting a bit of water to make it puddly, and then adding a bit more paint to build up a nice puddle. And then my last colour is, I'm going to do the same with the blue, and this is a cobalt blue, which is one of my favourites because it mixes really nicely with other colours. It makes lovely greens, makes quite nice purples, sort of muted purples, makes lovely greys. So with my 3 colours mixed, I'm going to grab a bit of my red over here. Mine's got a bit purpley already, I think, because my paints are never clean. So I'm just adding a bit more water here. And I'm going to take a little bit of my yellow, just a little touch of yellow, and bring it into the red. So you're looking for just a tiny bit of yellow. So I'll pop my camera down a bit there so that it doesn't go really orange, just a touch. And what I'm getting here is quite a nice pink rather than an orange. And the more yellow I add to that, the more orange it will go. So I've got quite a nice pinky red there, and that's going to be my worm colour. If it has gone orange, you can add a tiny touch of blue and it will sort of neutralise it a bit and make it a bit less orangey. But that's what we're starting with, is that lovely pinky colour. And as a warm-up, load your brush up with your pinky colour, pop it on the page and try to draw some of these worm shapes. So I'm just going to use the width of my brush and I'm looking carefully at the shape. And it comes to a little point there, but it's quite quick. Put my brush down and then I'm looking at the image and I'm just following the shape really slowly, gently moving the paint along. This one has got like a little notch at the bottom of its tail, so I'm going to bring my brush in this way. And where there are little pools of watercolour, I quite like that. And what if you just grab a little bit of your blue paint and just drop it into that pool, you'll get quite a nice effect of this kind of colder colour that some of the worms have. So let's do a few more. I've got a bit of blue on my brush now from before, so let's see what that does. So I'm doing this one here. And if you've got a little pile of worms, or one worm that's wiggling around, this is a really good quick way of capturing the wiggles, because it doesn't really matter if it's not exactly right, because no one's going to say, oh, I don't think the worm did wiggle like that, did it? And sometimes worms, they kind of twist and turn into these little spirals like this. And that's hard to draw really quickly, but it's really easy to do with a brush and a bit of watercolour. So a few more. Let's try this one here. And if you notice there's a particular change in the colour of the worm that you are painting, you can just drop in a little bit of yellow if it looks a bit more yellowy. Or whilst the paint is wet, you could just drop in just a little bit of blue. Just wherever you see those little puddles of paint. And you've got quite an interesting starting point. If your puddles of paint have gone a bit blobby, rinse your brush off. And just sort of, I squeeze mine out a little bit so it's damp. And then you can just sort of soften those little bits if you want to. But I quite like the immediate, imperfect little wormy look. And this one that's drying, you can see where those puddles have dried. It's given us quite a good sort of head and tail end of our little worms. So if you were doing a sketchbook page of worms, you could do a few of these little studies, but then if, say, you had a flower here, you could just make up your wormy shape to sort of fit around whatever composition you've got that's missing something. So they're good fillers, and that's always useful to have in a sketchbook or nature journal. It's just a little thing that you can fill a gap with. Petals and leaves and seeds are also really good little fillers, but today we're on worms. I'm going to take a bit more red now, so I'm going to just try and do a couple that are a bit brighter and redder and just see what they look like, because this is our experiment page. What I like about working like this as well as it being immediate is that I like to just feel the paint on the page and watch the little puddles of water. And it's very, you know, I like moving these little puddles of water. That looks a bit like a snake, that one. Moving them around with the tip of my brush. I just find it very relaxing, and it's a double bonus when you've got something like worms. We can't really go wrong. I'm adding a bit of blue in there. It's like they were designed to be painted with watercolour, I think, worms. And just this dropping in of colour is interesting. I'm not mixing it around, I'm just dropping in. I'll pick up a little bit of yellow, drop that in. I'm not sure what it's going to look like. Interesting, just watching them dry, and this one's particularly bright, but as you can see with these, this is going to dry lighter, so I'm going to be interested to see what that bright one is going to turn out like. So, I mean, you could carry on doing this now, couldn't you, for the next hour, quite happily. We're just meditatively painting worms. Let's try the other version. So we're going to go back to these in a minute with our pencil. But let's try drawing the worms whilst we wait for those to dry. I've now lost my pencils. There we go. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did with my brush with a pencil. So I'll just move that out of the way a bit more room. And I'm going to basically draw one edge of the worm with my pencil. So I'm going to pop my pencil down on the paper, look at the one edge shape, and really I'm doing it sort of blind because I'm mostly looking at this worm and then just allowing my pencil to follow that shape. And I'm not worried if it's going to go a little bit wrong. Again, like the sort of meditative painting, it's really very nice just to slowly draw that shape. And you don't need to look at your worm now. Do another line that follows your first line in parallel, about the same width as your worm. I'm glancing down there and I can see that at this end, at this worm's tail, there's just a little point, so I can bring those together to make a point. And then at the head, I think it's the head, there's a slightly more bulbous shape, so I can at the end bring that more bulbous shape in to my worm. So I'm going to do that again, just with some of the other worm shapes, because that's again, it's just nice to look and follow and observe, and whilst you're drawing, looking at the shapes, it allows you to see things that maybe you wouldn't notice about a worm. I didn't realise quite how many lovely colours worms were. I just kind of thought they were pink. You can get green worms, brown ones and red ones and orange ones, and these are like multicoloured worms. So I don't know, maybe they're an extremely rare species in my raised beds. So when you've got a worm that it kind of looks like a bit of foreshortening on this worm here, just by following that that shape, the line system where you're drawing one side of the worm shape and then you're just mirroring it. It's a nice way to start drawing. I think this could be a great sort of reset for you if you're experienced artist, just to reconnect with your line, with your mark and with your looking. And if you're new, it's a nice way to start looking carefully at something that's not too hard to draw. I think you immediately start to feel the benefits of how nice it is to look and draw as well. So I'll go up to add a few more worms. Now, just before this call, Jules, I watched a really lovely, I think it was about 4-minute documentary on YouTube, which was part of I think it was part of an edition of Spring Watch that had been added. And it was an interview with, and well, almost like a little presentation by a lady called Emma Sherlock, who is the president or chairwoman of the Earthworm Society of Great Britain.
Oh.
And I've heard her interview before, and I've never heard anyone so enthusiastic about worms as Emma Sherlock. So I'd really urge anyone to go and watch this little 4-minute documentary on YouTube, Spring Watch, and I think it's called The Wonder of Worms. You will learn everything you need to know in about 4 minutes. So just a quick disclaimer, this worm is this one, but I decided that if it was gonna if I was going to draw it correctly, it was going to cross over this one, so I just adjusted it. So artistic license is 100% allowed in this drawing workshop.
That sounds wonderful, actually. I was just thinking, yeah, that's I think the earthworms need love. So thank you for the thank you for letting us know about that. I think we need to go and put that in the notes.
And they do so much, and we don't really think about it, but the Earthworm Society of Great Britain help provide information about the conservation of earthworms. But obviously the work that they do processing organic material and providing a food source for other larger species of animals. Almost everything eats worms, poor little things. They are heavily predated. And so they're important as part of that food chain as well. And Emma Sherlock works, she's a worm specialist at the Natural History Museum. And like I said, I've never heard anybody talk about worms like she does. Okay, so I'm quite happy with all of my little worm outlines there. And now what I want to do with my pencil is look carefully at some of the details. So I can see there are some stripes of sort of lines on the worms, and then there's a little band which is called the clitellum. Quite often you see these little bands on certain species of earthworms, and those are things I really want to add to my drawings because they're going to add the form and the shape. So at the moment these look like little sort of squashed worms. And by adding the curve of the stripe and the curve of the clitellum, we will suddenly give them form and shape, and they'll start becoming a bit more three-dimensional. And so you need to imagine really that they are like sausages, which they are. And by adding a curved line around you don't have to do like lots and lots of stripes, but just in a few places, a few collections of curved lines, gradually you start to see the form of this little worm. I can't remember which one I was drawing then. Has it got a clitellum on it? But I guess we could sort of add them in, couldn't we, wherever. Which one was that one, wasn't it? So yes, it has. It's got a little band here. So I'm going to add a bigger band there, and then just thickening those lines out a little bit. So then a few more. And then a few round to the end. Then our worm is really now starting to take shape. It's a really simple method actually for all insects. So if you draw the shape of, say, a body shape of a butterfly or a bee or a caterpillar, and then by adding some contoured lines, you just create that body shape. And you can do it again through shading with a pencil, so adding a bit of tone, but this is quite a nice way to really carefully and slowly, again, like a meditation, almost like you're doodling, you're still looking, but your worm at this stage might have wiggled off, and but you know that you can just add these little bits in, and suddenly your worm has taken its form, but you've got that shape, you've drawn that shape really nice and quickly whilst it was there. I mean, you could actually just doodle worms whilst you're on the phone, couldn't you? Just doing doodly lines and then doing another doodly line, joining them up and adding these curved lines and just colouring them in lots of like multicolours. I wonder if anyone is a worm doodler by nature. It says a lot about you what you doodle on the phone. I don't know if you're a worm doodler, what that's going to say about you. I just write my name repeatedly when I'm on the phone to my mum or my auntie or my granny, the long talkers. It's quite a nice slow thing to do, isn't it? Just looking, and again, use it, you could use your artistic license if you think that this band needs to be somewhere else. If you're doing a very specific scientific illustration of a worm, then you do need to look a bit harder. But when we're just doing a fun drawing, we're trying to capture something, we're kind of trying to capture the feeling of something. That's generally how I like to work in a more illustrative way. So it gives you permission to have a bit more fun with the way that you are capturing things. Okay, so there are my wigglies, and I'm going to do the same thing to a few of these. We're going to paint those in a minute, but so I don't put my arm in those, I'm going to just come back whilst I've got the pencil in my hand and do my on the top drawing, but not really sticking exactly to the line. It doesn't really matter if it's a bit wonky and wobbly, because it gives it a bit of wormy energy. These would look just nice in a sketchbook page, I think. Doing a bit of a broken line on these ones. So there's that one. Oh, I can't remember which one's which. Oh, that was my made up one, wasn't it? This is the trouble, isn't it, when you've got so many lovely worms to work with. I'm changing this one a little bit, like, and redrawing it in a way. Oh no, I think this one I used a bit of artistic license as well. So, I'm having a nice time. That's the main thing, isn't it? I didn't realise quite how important this simple form of drawing is, even, as I've said before, if you're an experienced artist. I did a drawing workshop, it was like an experimental one during lockdown, where the idea was just to get people connected to a piece of paper with a drawing tool. And lots of the people attended hadn't drawn anything since they had been at school. And one of the techniques that the lady used was she just had a series of very squiggly lines, and you had to very carefully follow the squiggly lines with your pencil. So you weren't tracing them, you're on a separate piece of paper, and you just had to really slowly get it as accurately as possible, the wiggly line to match her wiggly line. And it was, of course, an exercise in seeing and getting confident putting pencil on a page, because for a lot of people they weren't confident doing that. They were terrified of making a mark on the page. And I have lots of experience putting marks on paper, but I found it so nice to just slowly feel what it was like, and to make those movements without doing a you know, a proper finished drawing. So this one, I'm going a bit mad. I'm bringing the lines outside of the worm. And one of the other exercises she did was to write, it was near Christmas, and she got you to write the numbers of the days of December, so the Advent, 1 to 24, all over a piece of paper, draw circles around them and just join the numbers up with a pencil. So you found number 1 and then joined it to number 2. So it was like doing join the dots. And it was so nice. So I'm just, as you can see with these worms, I'm doing my curved lines, but just because we're being illustrators here, I'm bringing some of the lines out, some of them close together. Some of them are coming out of the body of the worm to give it a bit of energy. And you can experiment with adding a bit of pressure to your line to get a strong, thick little curve. And then you could do very gentle pencil curves. How does that affect the look of your worm? If you press hard, this one I'm sort of rolling my pencil, so I'm getting a bit of an unstable line. So quite an interesting thing to do if you've got more experience and you just want to create more informal work. You're drawing it, you're sort of returning your line to how it was maybe when you were a child, which is the aim of so many artists, is to return to that state of creativity without worrying about what people think. That's a nice thing to think about when you're working with nature, because that's one of the things that we all did when we were younger. I think, you know, when you're at primary school, whatever year that was, nature was always a source of good schooling, I think, like good days out where you got to go outside and collect things and draw them and look at them. So slowly this is coming together and I'm really enjoying this. And I've got this crossed over worm, which is going to pose more of a drawing problem because but because I've done it with paint first, I've got that nice outline. So I'm going to cross that bit over. That bit of the worm is going to sit on top. And then that bit is going to be underneath. So it's giving me a really good guideline. Might put the talon band in the center there and curve my lines around. How are your worms, Jules? Are they coming on?
They are coming on. I must admit, I was completely lost there. I just, I'm really drifting off, you know, with my worms, Lucia. It's brilliant.
Isn't that nice? Just to, and that's, I think, because they're so simple in a way, because yeah, you start to get lost in your paint or lost in your line without really having to worry about what it looks like. That's one of the worst things for drawing, isn't it? Is when you start to have doubt in your mind that it's not looking how it should look. And that's something that we need to push aside when we're working like this, and little worms help with that, don't they?
It's incredibly meditative. I have to say, I just thought, oh, I forgot what I was doing. I was just completely away with the worms.
Away with the worms.
Yeah.
I'm sure they haven't got any stress or worries. They're not worried about what they're going to have for tea later or they need to pop to Tesco's. They've just got mud. So maybe we all need to be a bit more worm, Jules, I think.
Yes, perhaps we should be adopting that as a, yeah. Definitely. Our poor little worms. They don't get enough love anyway, so this is really lovely to highlight them.
Yeah, I think so. They're so important as well.
Absolutely.
We've got a couple of very friendly robins in our garden who have become so tame, and They are like my best buddies when I'm weeding because of the massive amount of worms that we've got in our garden. We are next to a field, and I think where all the ploughing is going on, all the worms have escaped into our garden, which is great for the robins. And we've got one robin who we've had for a couple of years, and he's still about, but he's getting on a bit this year. He's got a nest of chicks with his, well, I think it's a he, I'm assuming it is. We call him Harry because he's got a recognisable injury to his forehead, which looks like a lightning bolt scar. So after Harry Potter, we've got Harry the Robin, and he's so tame that he'll come and eat out of my hand, and because he's identifiable with this lightning bolt scar, we know that it's him. But he's now, like I said, he's getting on a bit, and he's looking a little bit worse for wear, and I think that the rearing of another sort of nest of chicks, which I can only imagine is incredibly hard work, and especially wearing on a rather ancient robin. So I've been soaking mealworms in boiling water, because this is what I've heard is a really brilliant thing to do for birds. Because they're young, they can't bring any moisture into the nest for their young. So if you're putting out, if you've got dry bird food and seeds and nuts and stuff, and birds bringing it back to their young, then the young are essentially dehydrating. And even with dry mealworms, and I thought I need to give Harry a hand because he's like an OAP of robins. I'm not digging enough worms for him, so I'm soaking mealworms. So I have actually got little bowls all over the house and garden and in my studio, little like damp mealworms floating around in water, and he'll just come and take them out of my hand, which is really nice.
Oh, that's excellent. Well done. Yeah, that's lovely. He's obviously got so trusting of you as well.
Yeah, and I've got a little whistle, and when I do the little whistle, he comes and sort of has a bit of food, so it's good. And he's very wary of the cats, which is great. So now that I have I've gone over those, I'm going to just paint these, but very similarly to how I did those first worms. We're just same colours, but we're just reversing the technique, really, which is a nice way to try two different methods. The painting first method could also be done with a pink marker pen, watercolour marker pens, but it's a really good way of getting stuff down really quickly. And the drawing way, when you draw first and then add paint, I think is a much slower way. It tends to slow the brain because you think more about filling and colouring it in. But that's also good too. So it's nice to have these two techniques and see which one works for you. Quick or slow, or both, depends on how much time you've got. So I'm just, what we did before, we stuck a bit of red in, and then I picked a bit of the yellow up and made this lovely pinky colour. I'm going to add a little bit of blue to mine's got a little bit orange, and I'm going to paint them, but not particularly carefully, and just on one side. So I'm just sort of painting one edge of the worm, and I'm leaving a little bit of it, as you can see, white. So I've coloured it in, but very wonkily. And I think this pinky side is probably the side that's in contact with the ground, and then that slightly highlighted side is has got a bit of light to it. I am just going to add a little bit of colour onto that white, so break it up a little bit. It doesn't matter if some of it gets coloured, it's just quite nice to have a little bit of light there. Don't worry about if it goes over your lines. And remember that you can drop in some of those other primary colours into your worms whilst they're still wet. So whilst you can see a little bit of glistening, quite a lot of these worms in the pictures are quite blue at the top of their head. They've got a bit of warmth there. So I'm just gonna drop in a bit of that blue into the wet paint, and it will mix with the red if it's still damp, and you'll get a cooler purple. So this one I'm going to experiment with and maybe go in with the blue to start with. I'm not sure how this is going to turn out, but it's nice to experiment. We've only got 3 colours, and that's nice because this is limiting all of the decisions that we need to make, limiting the steps, which makes everything much more accessible. So this is going to be much more purpley. So over the top of that blue, I'm just painting the red. I haven't got a clue. This wasn't in the plan. I just had a sudden thought that that might be an interesting thing to do, and that you've got to go with these things as an artist, haven't you? And hope for the best. And it might look terrible. It might look brilliant, and you might have created your own little nature journaling breakthrough. So you might need to keep re-wetting your watercolour, and you might need to keep remixing just a little bit of the yellow in. So what you'll get if you have to keep remixing is slightly different colours, slightly different values or levels of colour, but they are the same pigment, so it'll all start to sit together. I'm going to put more yellow into this one, I think. So it's gone a bit orangey now. These are a nice way to work with primary colours as well. Something that we're quite familiar with, but just to see them mix in the water is always a real pleasure for me. And if they're not mixing, I rinse my brush off so it's nice and clean. I give it a little wring out, usually over my pot, just with my fingers like that, so not on a piece of paper. And whilst your brush is just damp, you can mix the colours if they're not doing their thing. Just dabbing, don't go crazy with your colour mixing. If you've, like me, you've put it down little drops of colour and maybe it's a bit dry, you know, you might need just to add a little bit of water with a damp brush. So some of these I'm really happy with, and I would just leave. Like this one, it's quite bright and vibrant, and I love that about it. And then this one, well, that was one of the ones I did before where I did the underpainting. The ones that are a bit paler, I think I might just pick up a little bit more red, even though now they're dry, sort of reddy pink, and just add a little bit more of an edge to them. This colour sort of dropping in, really it's just aimed to be very, very quick, a quick little sketch to capture that wormy vibe. And I can see that these ones where I've drawn and then painted, I've got a bit more punchy colour variation, whereas these where I was painting the line first are much more subdued. So if you feel like yours have the colour sort of run out of them a little bit and you want a little bit more colour, you can just go over them again. So it'll just pop up to my other camera so you can, so just again, just bring in a little bit more of your red, and then I grab a little bit of yellow. And if you're a pro watercolorist, you'll know that the transparency of watercolor acts a bit like stained glass or like layers of tissue paper over each other. If you're new to watercolor, that's a lovely thing to enjoy about watercolor, that once you've got a layer of paint that's dry, you can then paint exactly the same color over it. I'm not doing all of it, I'm just doing a little bit of at the ends of the worm, just a little line of colour, and then you get 2 layers of colour. So it's really good if you've mixed a bit of a washed out colour to start with, and it's dried and it looks a bit insipid and it hasn't got a lot of punch, to know that you can just mix that same colour again and add another little layer, maybe not all over, just to the head and the tail and a few of the edges. It's nice to know that you can do that. I just think that how watercolour dries is just very fitting of a worm. Whoops. So if you've got I've gone a bit over there, and I know I said it's fine to go over the lines, but I think that's really affected the point of that little worm. So I'm washing my brush off, and then I'm gonna dry it on a piece of kitchen paper and just mop that like I would be, mopping a spill up on the kitchen floor. Just mop with your dry brush, wipe it off, and then just pick up that little bit of water, and then I've corrected that. And if it's completely dried and you think, oh damn, I've gone over that line, you can just pop a little bit of water on it, re-wet it, give it a little wiggle, and do the same thing. So all is not lost. So I'm happy with the colour of my worms now. This one again is looking a bit washed out, these two, but you can at least see the contrast now of adding that extra bit of colour to those, and in comparison to these, it's given them again much more life, I think. And the last thing I'm going to do is just to again add to that lovely form, is to add a little bit of shadow underneath, which I'm going to do with my blue paint, which has now got a little bit of red in. So there's my blue, and I'm going to add a little bit more of that red in to make a purple, only a tiny little bit of red. So it's still bluish, it's not really, really purpley. I want a little bit more. I would say it's like a kind of a dusty bluebelly kind of colour. Rinse my brush off. So I've got quite a watery mix here, and I'm just going to grab a little bit more of that yellow because mine's gone a bit orangey. Water my yellow down, take a bit of it off my brush and just add a touch of yellow to this. Oh, it's gone a bit green, which it wasn't supposed to do. I put too much yellow in. So I'm going to add just a little bit more red. And a little bit more blue. And what I'm looking to get is like a bluey grey. And just by adding those three colours, just readjusting, you'll get a lovely sort of bluey grey colour. You could just stick with the blue. I've probably overcomplicated things, but it's nice to know that you can make this lovely range of colours from those three primary colours that you've got. So I'm watering this down. So it's not a really punchy mix. It's very, very watery. I'm going to take some of that paint off my brush, and then just on one side of the worm, so choose one side, follow the line along. So I'll go up close on this and just add a little bit of shadow, and you can go over the edge of your worm and on the paper a little bit. And then it looks like it's that. I'm just adding a bit more just so you can see. So it gives a little bit of shadow to the edge of the body of the worm, and then a little bit of shadow on your sketchbook page. So what it will look like is that these little worms are wiggling around on your sketchbook page. You could probably do some interesting little splatters of brown paint as well to look like they've just been dug up, like I've got on my example. So I've got a bit of a blob there and I don't want it, so I'm doing my mopping technique again, just mopping it up, because I want that blue to be very light. I don't want it to overpower the pink of the wormy body. It's a very quick little thing. It's so effective, I think, at the form. And there's lots of extra things you could use to do these shadows that I see watercolour artists do. So you could use a grey water-based marker pen, and you just run that over the watercolour and the worm, exactly like we're doing with our paint. But I think it's very nice to keep your colours and materials reasonably limited to one wet, one dry, which is what we've got. We've got watercolour as our wet medium, pencil as our dry, and it just takes away, again, those decision-making issues that sometimes stop us doing. They make us think a bit too much and stop us doing. Okay, so I've added all my little shadows. And the last thing I'm going to do, and this is completely optional and really you should wait until everything's fully dry, is I'm going to add a little white highlight to my worms to give that extra bit of form. And you can do that in lots of different ways. So I've got 3 options here, which is a really good quality white pencil. It needs to be good quality. So this is a polychromos Faber-Castell. I like the Luminance white pencils as well. They're really good. These are also good. This is a very stumpy Neocolor 2 watercolor crayon. So it's like a watercolor pencil, but it's just pure pigment, like you would get a crayon, you know, when you're little, Crayola crayon. But again, really strongly saturated. Or you could use a gel pen, a white gel pen. So I might try all 3 and then you can see what sort of effect it has. And I'm going to go super close up on this one. And sometimes on the camera, they don't show up as well, the little highlights. I'm going to do a few little white lines in the same way that I did the curved brown lines. So just picking up a few of those little shapes. And it works particularly well in darker areas of paint. So we've got 3 ways that we've created a bit of extra form on these worms. So we've got our curved line, the shadow, and the little highlight. I'm going to try with the white here. And the shadow is, the highlight, I should get my pen working. The highlight needs to be incredibly subtle so that you almost can't see it, that anybody looking at your work can't quite figure out why it looks so effective. So imagine that this is like the cherry on a cake. You don't add lots and lots of decorations. You might just add 1 little cherry or a few. You can overdo these highlights, firstly, because the effect to start with looks nice, but then you do too many and it looks a bit rubbish. Also because they're really nice to do, so they're highly addictive. So you have to sometimes put your pen down and tell yourself, step away from the desk. You are done. It's a really good cheat as well if you are not a member of the watercolour police, because they will tell you need to leave these little white highlights, but I love being able to add them in at the end. I don't want to think about them at the beginning stages. I want to add them as the icing. I like that a lot. So so there's our little earthworms. And they sit beautifully on a page, as you can see, where you can add other little things. But you could also, if you've got information about earthworms, a really great way to add it would be to add text in some little gaps. So if you find some little spaces and you want to write a little bit about earthworms, make some notes about your observations. Maybe you make notes about other things that you're experiencing whilst you were drawing those worms. Perhaps you chat about what you're experiencing with your other senses. What did you hear whilst you were drawing them? What did you think about? What's the weather like? Tell the story of the rest of this day by just illustrating the worms. So it's telling a tiny part of a bigger, it's a tiny part of a bigger picture, basically. But this journal page could be all about your garden or all about a walk that you've taken. But all you've needed to do is just draw the worms. So don't forget to add a little date. So I like to add a little drawn panel like that in the corner with the date. And you've got a really lovely sketchbook page. So how was that for you, Jules? How did you get on with your little wiggly worms?
I think I got on really well with my wiggly worms. I was totally lost there, just completely drifting away, doing all sorts of things that I would never normally do in my journal. It was fantastic, Lucia. Thank you. Just feel like, yes, it was a really meditative process, and it was great fun. And as you said, you know, if you're a regular or experienced artist, it's just excellent to be able to just completely say, right, I'm just going to take time to play and be quiet and think and be calm. And this is just the perfect exercise. And just brilliant if you're starting off, because it's just so much fun.
Yes, yeah.
2 pages of worms. I'm very happy.
And I was just thinking as I was drawing that actually, like you said, as a more experienced artist, what you tend to do is then start to actually make things much more complicated for yourself as your knowledge and your skills grow and your capability with materials. Sometimes it becomes so overcomplicated that you just then your head is a whirl. And so to take something very simple to draw and simple to paint can be liberating and just recalibrates yourself. But one thing I meant to say as well is that you can obviously do a whole sketchbook page because they're nice to do and they're meditative. But if you only had a very limited amount of time, to do one worm isn't going to take you very long at all. But again, it could tell the story of a really lovely walk that you've been on, because you can add the text about something completely unrelated to that little worm. It's just a very simple illustrative tool that kind of locks that text onto a journal page. So I think for me that would be the takeaway, is that it can be so adapted, these small invertebrates and other small insects and creatures and items that you find in your garden. Have a look, they're simple to do and they're great fillers, so find your journal fillers.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. And we also learned a great deal about earthworms, which is, I said, really, really important wherever you are in the world. You know, we've all got earthworms, and you said they definitely need more love. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks so much, Jules. Happy earthworm drawing.
Bye,
everybody.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Bye.